Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory tutorial. My name is Julian. I am so glad that you are here, both on Instagram and YouTube. Hello, YouTube, I see you. Hello, Instagram, I see you. Today, we're going to be covering the idea that comes from Žižek, that comes from Badiou, which is that you can't have love without the fall. We're going to be continuing the Monday morning lecture series on the philosophy of love. And this is going to be a 60-minute tutorial. You can join by just sitting here and watching, or you can download the entire series on my Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. I'll say it one more time because the link is not in my bio. www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. Hello, everybody. Also, I want to say those of you who are leaving comments, thank you so much. One of the absolute most wonderful things is hearing where you guys are joining me from. I see someone joining us from Iran, which is just wild. That's amazing. I'm so grateful to be doing this, and I just feel so humbled by the fact that you guys also enjoy this. It's the best way for me to start my week. I never was a Monday person until I started doing this. I love that we can just set the tone for the entire week by having an hour-long philosophical engagement together. I see you guys from Portugal, South Africa, India, Ireland. It's amazing. That's so cool. Please keep it coming. Makes me really, really happy. Portugal, I see someone from Portugal. China, that's incredible. Greece, that I could just sit here and read it out. I mean, shout out to everybody. Australia, it's beautiful. And the UK, wonderful. Canada, France. All right, Bali, it's so crazy. All right, Bainbridge Island, Washington, that's pretty close by. Australia, Toronto, Canada. Okay, my eyes are glued to this. This is beautiful. Mwah. Thank you guys so much. More Portuguese people, that's amazing. Okay, so today we're gonna be talking about one of my absolute favorite ideas from Žižek's take on love. Namely, the idea that you can't have love without the fall. Or as the writer Cervantes once said, that you can't fight love. You can only run away from it. That when you're faced or confronted with love, perhaps that's the wisest thing to do, is simply to, instead of falling head over heels, to turn around and sort of head in the other direction. And of course, this is something that Žižek takes from Alain Badiou, the French philosopher. So we're going to talk about Badiou's idea of love as an event, or love as a truth process. And then perhaps if we have time for it, we can also talk a little bit about the Socratic idea that to be a philosopher, to be someone who loves wisdom, or has the wisdom of love, if you will, is somebody who tries to achieve a kind of living death in their lifetime. That's where we're going to end, on a more metaphysical note about the nature of love and the nature of philosophy. Before we begin, I just want to say a huge, massive thank you to everybody who continues to support these classes and this project and this page. It really genuinely is only due to our global community of patrons that this is even still a thing. 2 years ago, I left academia. I started hosting these online lectures, and we've just never stopped. We've never looked back. And so a huge, huge thank you to everybody who continues to fund these classes. If you'd like exclusive access to my ebook, which is an introduction to Žižek and Lacan, if you'd like access to the members-only podcast, our Discord server, audio downloads for every class, and this is what Jeneline provides, which I think is the biggest deal, edited transcripts for every single class. So if you'd like to follow these classes in whatever form you like, please go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. All right, thank you guys so much. And for all of you joining from around the world, I'm so glad that you're here. The goal and the dream is to make philosophy open access and accessible to everybody, anywhere, anytime. And I think if I could summarize the goal of this series, it's to say, let's take love seriously. Let's talk about love in a serious fashion, because I don't know, maybe this is just me projecting, but I think it can be really hard to talk about love without succumbing to cliche. And yet, arguably, love is one of the most serious concepts within the idea of philosophy, going back to the idea that philosophy is the love of wisdom. And one of the things that I've tried to argue in this series is that it's not just the love of wisdom, it's also the wisdom of love. The idea being that love is a kind of conceptual key that allows you to unlock the very problems and the very questions and perhaps also some of the answers of existence itself. And so I think that taking love seriously is a good thing. I think it's a useful thing, I think it's a helpful thing, and I think it's something that is integral to what it means to be alive. I think that if we try to pretend that we don't have to take love seriously, that we just trifle with love, I think we do ourselves a disservice. And so my goal is to hopefully provide you guys with a space in which it's okay to take love seriously, to think about love, to reflect on your own love, whether it's love you've had, love you've lost, and to do it in a manner that is engaged with philosophy and literature and art and poetry in a manner that elevates the conversation. Hopefully, that's my goal. Okay, let's begin. Make yourselves comfortable. We're going to be going for about, 55 minutes or so. And thank you again for everybody leaving a comment here. I really do appreciate it. Okay, so one of Slavoj Žižek's most interesting ideas to me, and perhaps one of his most underrated ideas, is the idea that you can't have love without the fall. In fact, that in most languages, this is how we refer to finding love, is a fall into love. And obviously, falling is not something that we try to do on a day-to-day basis. Falling can be very dangerous, it can be lethal. Anybody who's ever fallen really hard knows that the paradoxical experience of falling is that it happens so fast that it's like your brain has to catch up. It's like one moment you're standing here and then you're on the floor and you're like checking yourself like, did I get hurt? How bad did I get hurt? And that process of falling is the process by which your perspective on the world suddenly radically changes. First you see the world from up here, then you're looking at the world from there. When we say that love or somebody sweeps you off your feet, that's not necessarily a good thing. It's a discombobulating experience. It changes you, and it can also hurt you. And so today we're going to talk about some of the political and perhaps even Marxist and metaphysical aspects underlying Žižek's idea that love has to incorporate the fall. In fact, that a love without the fall might not even really be love. Now, I want to start here briefly with one of the key thinkers that influences Žižek in everything he does. And this is, of course, Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst. Now, one of the things about falling in love is that somebody who was once a stranger suddenly no longer appears to you as a stranger. It's actually one of my favorite type of TikTok videos is somebody who films their partner and says, I can't believe that this stranger is now living in my house. And if you think about it, right, if you're in a relationship, every once in a while it's good to reflect upon the fact that like the person who knows you so intimately, the person who knows you better than you know yourself, who has seen you naked more than any other person, this person is a rando that you found somewhere, and now they're like the person that seems to define you. It's like one of the most radical, evolutions you could have in your identity is to have someone who is a stranger to you suddenly become the person who is most intimate for you, the person who you could no longer live without. And this process by which the stranger suddenly becomes the lover is what Lacan calls the sublime. Now, Lacan's technical definition for the sublime is the object elevated to the level of the thing. And what he means is that there's a relationship by which we take something which is seemingly ordinary and we elevate it into a seemingly metaphysical premise. Of course, this exact same thing happens when you're in love. Somebody who's just an ordinary person, an other, somebody else, a living, breathing human being with their own life and their own baggage and their own identity, a stranger to you, suddenly becomes elevated to this ideal, like the person that you have to be with to be happy, which is not a healthy thing to experience, right? This is, again, the aspect of the fall is you were fine until you fell in love. And I think like, for example, in the Symposium, Plato writes about this, that love is a kind of madness because all the things that would otherwise motivate you no longer motivate you. And suddenly you become prone to jealousy and spite and envy and all of these emotions, vanity that you wouldn't otherwise have. And so the experience of falling in love, and this is something that Freud already wrote about, that love is a kind of madness. And it's specifically the madness by which somebody who's simply an ordinary person, a stranger, if you will, suddenly appears to you as having some metaphysical essence, something that will unlock something deep inside of you. In fact, the idea that there is now a hole inside of you that has to be filled. That unless you're with that other person, you're not going to be happy. The opposite of love is unrequited love. It's an absolute, right? When you fall in love, it's an infatuation. It's a crush. I've talked about this in the previous series. The act of falling in love is the process by which you go from being a sane person to a crazy person, a person who experiences a hole or a lack that has to be filled by somebody else. And you can't sustain this, obviously. There has to be a breaking point. Usually the breaking point is when you confront the other person and you say, do you love me? Do you want to date? Etc. You cannot be in this state of madness forever. Because think about it. It has nothing to do with who the other person actually is. You're idealizing them. You're putting them on a pedestal. You're saying, I want you to be perfect. That's what we talked about in the tutorial last week, that love is loving someone's imperfections, to say, I love you because you are imperfectly perfect. Love isn't saying, I want you to be this ideal thing. And so if we go back to Lacanian psychoanalysis, the sublime is the process by which the object is elevated to the divine. Object is elevated to the level of the thing. This is what happens when you first fall in love, which is that the object of your desire, namely a person, a stranger, is elevated to the level of the thing. The person who will release you, who will free you from what? From your madness. And this delirium that you undergo when you're in a relationship is precisely the idea of the fall. And when you fall into love, it means, and this is super obvious, I think, it means that you are vulnerable. It means that you can be hurt. That one of the paradoxes of love is that it is a double-edged sword. It has both the capacity to transform you and it has the capacity to break you. And that in a sense, the transformation that occurs is a kind of breaking. It's the breakage of the person who you thought you were before, but it's also the process by which a stranger suddenly becomes the person who is most intimate for you. It's this discombobulating experience of looking across the room and seeing somebody who you know so well and who you love so deeply, and yet fundamentally, they're just another person. This is also why for Lacan, the hysterical question within a relationship is always, do you really love me? Because if you think about it, love can't be proven in this sense. This is like one of those slogans that I've used before, which is that love is not a competition, it is repetition. Love means falling in love every single day again, finding multiple myriad ways to demonstrate your love to somebody. But that also means to reinvent your love for yourself, because if the fall into love is this sublime madness by which you elevate the object to the level of the thing, then vice versa, a sustained relationship is a desublimation. To put it in technical terms, essentially what that means is that in a relationship, the ideal that you had of the person becomes desublimated. Now you know them for who they are, which is precisely what love is. And then you realize that love isn't the process of sublimation. Sublimation is infatuation. Love is desublimation. Love is realizing that the truth of the other person, the love that you share, comes not through the fall, but it comes what happens after the fall, when you both get up together. And Žižek actually has a line here, which is fairly commonly used by others as well. The idea is that love is blind, but lovers are not. And what he means by that is that love may render you blind, right? You fall into love. And yet when you're a lover, when you're in a relationship, you know precisely who the other person is. In fact, you might know them better than they know themselves. And so the process of being in love, as opposed to the process of falling in love, is a process of desublimation in philosophical terms. And if the sublime for Lacan is simply how you take the object and you elevate it to the level of the thing, namely the stranger who suddenly becomes the person you need to have in your life, then in a relationship, it's a process of desublimation, the process by which the person who was your ideal now becomes your object again. And when I say object, I'm obviously not saying that you should treat them like an object, that you should turn them into, something like a tool or whatever. That would be incredibly toxic. But the point that I'm trying to make here is a metaphysical one, which is that in classic Hegelian fashion, we have what is essentially a negation of the negation. Namely that when you fall into love, you are negated. The very premise and the core of your existence in your being seems to crumble. And you fall into this delirium tremens, which is the process of idealizing somebody else. It's the crush, it's the infatuation. And then when you're in a relationship with that person, you find love. You realize that love doesn't exist on the plane of the sublime. Love is always a process of desublimation. In other words, the negation of negation. If falling in love negated you, then love is the process by which this negation is then re-negated. And this dual negation, or what the philosopher Hegel, the German idealist, called the negation of negation, is precisely the very condition for being in a relationship, for being in love. And so I want to put that idea aside for a moment, the idea of the negation of negation, because we'll get back to it in a moment. It's not just philosophical lingo, it's actually part of a much bigger argument that Hegel and Plato are making about the nature of love and what it does to us. Okay, so we've already introduced this idea about the sublime and the idea of falling in love. And this is a pretty good point to introduce Žižek's political critique of love. If you will, his critique of the ideology of love. Because when Žižek says that love isn't love without the fall, he's also making an argument about the manner in which we increasingly seek out romantic encounters in which we don't risk the fall, in which love has been neutered. And ironically, one of the things that happens is that the best way to neuter love is precisely by emphasizing sexuality. Žižek makes a slightly provocative argument. He says that we've become more promiscuous, and yet at the exact point that we've become more promiscuous, which means more ready to be sexually engaged with other people, it's at that exact point that we've become more afraid of love. That it's this weird paradox, which is that the more liberated we are when it comes to sexual expression, the more repressed we are when it comes to romantic expression. Now, what's important here is that he's not saying that sex is not romantic. It's not a binary where love is idealized as being sexless. This would be perverse. This is like, think about the Catholic Church, for example. When the Catholic Church tries to penalize sexuality by essentially arguing that, real love serves procreation, that's actually rendering love into an animalistic act. After all, for animals, love is just about procreation. It's just about sex. But what the Catholic Church fears is, of course, the metaphysical element within sex itself, which is another way of saying that when you have sex, you don't need the church. Suddenly you have access to the sublime, to the metaphysical. You feel like you are in touch with God when you have sex. It's also why sex can be an addiction. It's like the ultimate act of self-negation. And this lies at the heart of most addiction, which is the idea that it's not just that you can't say no, which is kind of like a vulgar moralization of the idea of addiction. Instead, addiction is about saying what I crave the most is a temporary moment of not being, and within that not being to find the bliss of my own existence. It's, again, the paradox of the negation of negation. A drug does the same thing that love does to you, which is that it temporarily shatters your core, your sense of self. And within that shattering, you suddenly feel like you have found yourself. This paradox, the negation of negation, is at the heart of the experience of being an addict or loving drugs. And this is also why love is a kind of drug. There's a beautiful scene in the HBO series Euphoria, where the main character, played by Zendaya, is talking with another person at AA, and he says, "What do you experience when you fall in love? Doesn't it feel like a drug? Like there's this thing that could torture you but could also release you." Right? And this process of being released from yourself in a painful way is precisely the idea of love. There's a great line from, I'm trying to remember who it is. I think it's Hugo von Hofmannsthal, but this is also in Proust. It's a common romantic idea that when you suffer from everything, in suffering you enjoy everything. It's like the melancholic's credo. The idea being that love is a kind of pain, and yet it's a kind of beautiful pain. The lover suffers more. Like when you're not in love, things don't feel as strong. you don't hurt as bad. There's something I think very dangerous about love, or infatuation at least, which is that it's painful, but it's enjoyably painful. It's like, you know, the romantic melancholic who's picking the petals of the flowers and saying, does she love me? Does she love me not? This is the hysterical question within psychoanalysis. Namely, not who are you, but what do I mean to you? This is also why the infatuation stage of a relationship can be a little bit toxic, right? Because it's about you. This is what people always realize, is that when you fall in love, when you have a crush, it's fundamentally about you. It's not about them. It's about your own self-discovery that you have a hole in your heart, that you didn't know that you could feel this strongly. I think that's why love is an education, especially when you fall in love for the first time. It's like, wow, I had no idea I could feel this much. It's like suddenly everything takes on a higher level of intensity. You listen to music and it's like, you really get it. You're like sobbing because you have a crush, you're in love. Everything becomes like an accelerator of your own emotion. You watch a movie in which two characters kiss or two characters fall in love and you really feel it. And so one of the things that love does when you fall in love is it has less to do with them and it has everything to do with you suddenly experiencing the world more vividly. It's like you've tapped into this thing that previously seemed to be barred from you. It's also why first love, especially when it is unrequited, can be all-consuming. It's like, it's exhausting to feel that much all the time. If you think about it, if the initial stage of a relationship is, again, to go back to the idea of the object elevated to the level of the sublime, the thing, it consumes you, it's exhausting. It takes a lot of energy to be that much in love all the time. And so one of the weird things about the desublimation that occurs when you're in a long-lasting relationship is precisely that it gets easier. It's less strenuous. It's less intoxicating. And yet precisely therefore, it is deeper. It is not consuming you. In that sense, like, love is a candle that you burn on both ends. It flares up and there's a lot of energy that is consumed in it. Anyway, so the quote is that from Hugo von Hofmannsthal is that he who suffers from everything is the person who enjoys everything. That love presents itself to you as a kind of suffering, as a kind of madness, as a kind of loss of self and reason. This is the infatuation stage, obviously. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that if this is what we fear, and yet if this is also the thing that gives us meaning, that we love, this is precisely what we lose when we only have encounters for sex. And Žižek's argument is that the more liberal we become about sexual exchange, the more repressed we are about romantic exchange. That it's almost embarrassing to tell somebody, I want you for more than just your body. Because it means that you're ceding some level of control. It's no longer just about your enjoyment. And this is one of the imperatives within modern society. No matter what you do, make sure that you have fun. No matter what you do, make sure that you put yourself first. All of which is fine, but the increasing individualization of life makes it fundamentally more difficult to allow ourselves to experience love as a fall. Because if you're falling in love, it means that you're falling into the other. You're falling into a kind of abyss in which the very individualizing features of your own life suddenly become questionable. And so the more individualized society becomes, the more dangerous it appears to us to actually fall in love. And if you think about it, like, if you're simply having sexual encounters with other people, which is fine, by the way, I'm not moralizing here. I'm not conservative about this. It's good to learn about yourself and learn about your body. But this is something that fits within your life. It's like, it doesn't disrupt you. If anything, this is exactly what people fear, is having a sexual encounter, and it's all fine unless you fall in love. And you fall in love and it's like, oh shit, now this is real. Now this is gonna mess with me. And now they're gonna have this problem, which is, what if they are not in it for love? And so interestingly enough, the more that you engage in sexually promiscuous behavior, the more dangerous love becomes. because love could shatter your enjoyment. And it's important to note here that when Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, makes this argument, he's not against dating culture. In fact, one of the things that he argues, and I think this is quite interesting, he says that a lot of conservatives or more old-fashioned people look at dating culture, like online or Tinder or something like this, and they say, it's all fake. It's not really who you are. After all, you have to take a photograph of yourself in which you flex your muscles and you try to make yourself more attractive than you are. And yet Žižek says that this doesn't bother him. That anytime you engage with somebody else, there's a fantasy frame. Like even on the most obvious literal sense, when you talk to somebody, like you could be talking to your teacher, you know that they are underneath being a teacher, they're a real human being. But being a real human being means that they do gross things like going to the bathroom, or that they're sweating, or that there could be so many things. Physical, biological reality by itself, an sich, is crass, it's vulgar, it's frightening. And so to sustain life for Žižek, we have to imbue life with fantasy. The idea of authentic connection with others without fantasy is itself a kind of fantasy. When you engage with another person, even on the most elementary level, you have to engage in fantasy. You have to treat them as if they weren't a real person. Because being a real person is almost like too horrifically vulgar. This is something that Žižek argues apropos sex as well. When we think about sex, or when we're having sex, we have to think about sex, right? This is one of the paradoxes of sex, is that you've probably heard the Freudian expression, which like Janelle Monáe uses in a song as well, which is everything is about sex except sex, which is about something else. And this is precisely the problem when you're having sex, which is that if everything is about sex, if everything is a symbol or a stand-in for sexual behavior, then what is sex about? And if you simply boil down sex to its most mechanical, biological reality, it's really just two people like rubbing up against each other and panting and sweating, and it's not romantic at all. And of course, if you think about this while you're having sex, then you can no longer have sex. The spontaneity of it disappears. And so in a weird way, when you're having sex in the real world, biologically, materially, you have to infuse it with fantasy. There always has to be a level of fantasy that allows you to continue interacting on the level of biological reality. Whether it's the fantasy of, I'm so attracted to you, the fantasy of being attracted to someone else, whether it's the idea of sex itself. Sexuality is the fantasy frame through which we access reality. And so what's important here is, again, this is an idea that Žižek takes from Lacan, namely that you can't access reality without fantasy. That reality isn't on one side and fantasy is on this side. Rather that reality is only made accessible through fantasy. That as soon as you boil something down to its hard core truth, its pure reality, everything disintegrates. You cannot live in a world of pure reality. It's an erotic experience. Like, think about people who suddenly develop a tic where they can no longer swallow food. It's because they've realized just the horrible, mundane reality that when you swallow food and it goes down here and it ends up in your stomach, it's like you become too self-aware. And so when you eat, you have to have fantasy. Oh, this tastes good. This is wonderful. This is a beautiful restaurant, or you've cooked this nice meal for me. We imbue reality with fantasy because otherwise we cannot deal or access reality as such. Okay, I want to take a step back for a moment. So Žižek says that the more promiscuous we become, the harder it is to actually fall in love. Because if love is that which disrupts us, then the very idea of promiscuity, of choosing your partner, of finding the ideal partner for you online, becomes something which is optimized, that is integrated into your life. And I want to stress again that this is not a moralizing conservative argument that sex is bad, or that having sex with multiple partners is bad. None of which is true. It's important to experience that, I think. It's important to explore and discover your own sexual identity, which is something that you, by definition, cannot just do by yourself. And yet, we risk commodifying the encounter, the romantic or sexual encounter, if it is simply another thing which can be optimized, then you risk losing the metaphysical fall into love. This is also why I've always argued that there is no type. When you have a type, it's actually a way of keeping love away. It's saying, here are the specific categories and attributes that I demand from a partner. And if they have these attributes, then I will consider falling in love with them. First of all, it's not how love works, right? When you fall in love, you will immediately realize that the person you've fallen in love with now becomes your type. In fact, that the process of being in a relationship is to realize that the person that you are in love with is a type unto themselves. They are their own type. They are the person who appears as if they were made just for you. This is what Žižek calls the retroactive contingency of a relationship or love, is that a person who was a stranger suddenly appears as if they were made and put on this earth for you. And of course it's a lie. Of course nobody was created just for you. And this mutual lie that we tell ourselves is precisely what a relationship is, which is that even though I didn't want to fall in love or expect to fall in love, once I do, it feels like everything that happened to me in my life was leading up to this moment. That's the retroactive effect of love, or what Hegel calls the contingency of necessity and the necessity of contingency, the process by which a seemingly accidental occurrence, namely meeting a stranger who then becomes your one, retroactively appears to you as a necessary sequence of events. And vice versa, and this is the more Hegelian dialectical point, the metaphysical point, that necessity can only ever emerge through this retroactive appearance of contingency. In other words, that it's not the accidental versus the fated, it's that fate is always the embrace of the accidental. This is the central insight, I believe, when it comes to why Sisyphus is happy. Sisyphus is happy not because he has changed his fate, but because he has embraced his fate. And through the subjective acceptance of his fate, he has made it his own. He has become the master of his fate, not because he's defied it, but because he's embraced it. And this is how we get to Badiou, Alain Badiou, the French philosopher, who describes falling in love as an event, capital E, or as a truth process. Because what for Badiou an event is, in its most clear form, most technical form, an event is something that happens to you externally and yet appears to contain the truth about yourself. It's kind of interesting, like you could read a book or you could see a work of art in a museum. And even though this was painted 200 years ago or written 200 years ago by somebody who's a complete stranger to you, it can feel like it unlocked something about your true self, right? This is what an event is. There's a great scene in one of my favorite movies called Ratatouille, animated film. And there's a scene in Ratatouille in which a very austere and stern food critic eats a dish. And the dish that is served up to him is a dish that resembles a childhood favorite meal. And he has this Proustian moment of recollection. It's like the smell of the Madeleine that transports him to his childhood. And he takes a bite of the food, and suddenly he's transported back to his childhood. And like this inner truth about his life is suddenly unlocked within him. Of course, it's not just unlocked, it was already locked within. And this process, this is the event. It's like the memory that suddenly is unlocked by means of a smell, or you eat a dish and suddenly you become a child again. That's the event. It's something that comes from the outside, seemingly accidental. It's external to you. And yet it unlocks something that was already within you, which you had not known to begin with. This is what Badiou calls the event, which is why Alain Badiou also says that an event is a truth process. And a truth process is simply another way of saying that you unlock the truth within yourself, seemingly through an external encounter. Of course, you can, there's many applications of this. Badiou makes the argument that the same is true in Christianity, that Christ on the cross is a truth event or a truth process, namely someone who appears to come from the outside, right? Christ as the supposed, Son of God, is precisely the one who unlocks the truth, namely that the core of the Christian faith is now within the community of the faithful themselves. This is Hegel has this already. Okay, so the philosopher Hegel, German idealist, he has an interesting idea, which is that Love is a metaphor for philosophy itself. Now, what he means by that isn't that we should love everybody and that if we love everybody, the world will be a better place or something like this. No, no. What Hegel means is that the process of love, which as I said before, is the negation of negation, is actually a metaphor for the entirety of philosophy and the unfolding of what he calls human spirit itself. And if you want to know more about that, go to the beginning of this tutorial or download it on Patreon, because I put all these lectures on Patreon as well. It's www.patreon.com/gentlyandjoy. Hegel says that what happens on the cross, when Christ dies on the cross, is that it's not the body of Christ that dies. It's the God of the beyond that dies. Which is another way of saying that in the crucifixion, we don't have the death of Christ. We have the death of the idea of a transcendental deity. Think about it. Up until the crucifixion, we still are stuck within this relatively binary, Platonic metaphysical structure by which we have the God in the sky, the God of power up there, and we have the world of appearances, the world of mortal finite beings. And that the whole goal of religion is to ascend to the heavens, to achieve that state of being by which you have transcended earth. And yet, when God, quote unquote, sends Christ, he desublimates himself on behalf of people. Because what is the crucial moment in the crucifixion? The crucial moment in the crucifixion is when Christ says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" This moment in which God, for a moment, stops believing in himself through the figure of Christ, the moment in which God desublimates on behalf of the other of the human community on earth. This is for Hegel metaphoric for what happens in love. The fall into love, falling in love, is for Hegel the exact same thing as God falling in love. God desublimating through the crucifixion on behalf of the human community into the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. This third excessive thing that emerges, the Trinity, namely the Holy Spirit, is therefore for Hegel synonymous with the process of what happens when you fall in love, namely two people meet and you desublimate, or as Lacan put it, you empty yourself out on behalf of the other into this stranger, and through that process, a third thing is born. Remember, we started this tutorial with the idea of the Brechian third thing. A couple has a third thing. That's what sustains them. And this third thing is love. It's the spiritual awakening of two people who have suddenly become one. It's a dialectical process of the negation of negation, which is why Hegel relates the idea of Christ on the cross to the idea of falling in love. And once you realize that this process, this metaphysical proposition about the manner in which the truth is unlocked precisely through a desublimizing process, you realize so many more things about the transition from Platonic metaphysics towards Hegelian post-metaphysics. And I know this is very technical, but think about it. If the Platonic metaphysical framework is the world, the allegory of the cave, in which you have the world of truth outside and the world of appearance within, and we have to seek the world of truth outside the world of the cave, then after Hegel, with the post-metaphysical stance, now it's no longer about transcending to a higher state of being. Now it's actually about desublimating. In fact, that sublimation and desublimation, rather than being opposites, become part and parcel of the same unfolding. They're two sides of the same coin. It's, if you will, a chiasmic process. It's ABXBA. That's chiasm. Classic chiasm rhetorical structure that the sophists already used. The idea of it's not about what, your country can do for you, it's what you can do for your country. This is a chiasmic structure. And what Hegel is essentially arguing is that the metaphysical argument, apropos Plato, isn't that it's a one-directional movement, A-B. It's not from the cave to the world outside the cave. Instead, it's precisely the fall itself that creates the essence. It's desublimation that is the core and the truth of the sublimating process. Sublimation is no longer how do I go from being down here towards up here. It's not arising into the transcendental. Instead, the transcendental exists precisely within the fall itself. And this is the ontological argument that Žižek is making when he makes an argument about love, which is that the ontological position that Žižek appropriates from Hegel is precisely that essence doesn't lie beyond appearance, but essence only emerges within the fall into appearance itself. In the same manner that love is a truth process for you, the person who you are, doesn't emerge when you aspire to a higher form of being in love. It's when you fall into love. And it's so, I know this is technical and I know this is a lot, but like it's so important that if you want to understand Žižek and Badiou's philosophy, you have to understand that they're not just making a popular argument about falling in love, a universal relatable argument. They're also making a metaphysical proposition, which is a Hegelian one. Namely that the whole point of metaphysics and philosophy is no longer transcendence. Instead, transcendence occurs under its supposed opposite. Namely that it is the fall itself that generates the thing through which you rise. And I know that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around, but it's actually like also not. Because once you realize that for Hegel, the entire point of Hegelian philosophy is to answer a problem that Kant had already proposed. Namely, the so-called Kantian, I was going to say Cartesian, but it's not, Copernican turn, the so-called Kantian Copernican turn. So what is the Kantian Copernican turn? In a nutshell. Basically, the classic philosophical proposition had been about the world of objects, the world of appearance, as I said before, the world in the cave, and the world outside the cave, the world of essence and truth, the ideal form. And the notion up until Kant pretty much was that objects in the world appear to us, and thereby they are a lesser deformed version of the ideal. This is also why Plato said that art was a copy of a copy. After all, if objects in the world, fruit and trees and animals and us, if we are copies of the divine, of the absolute, then art, by its very definition, is a copy of what was already a copy. And so Plato's idea was that instead of being into art, we should be looking for transcendence, and that art would actually lead us away. And yet the Hegelian argument is almost the exact opposite. It's saying, no, you don't go beyond the veil of appearance to the world of truth. You have to fall into the negation of negation, which is what art is. If the world is a copy of essence, then art is precisely the process by which you desublimate that process, by which art unlocks the truth within something, which unlocks the truth within yourself. And so what's really interesting here is that Kant, with his so-called Copernican turn, flips this on its head. If the traditional metaphysical divide had always been about the world of essence outside and the world of appearance on earth, Kant says, okay, but what are the conditions for actually transcending? What are the transcendental conditions? Which is why Kant's most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, is, in a sense, like a paradoxical formulation. If the pure, namely essence, which lies beyond the transcendental, is the opposite of reason, which is how we think the world and how things appear to us. After all, this is the Cartesian subject. I think, therefore I am. If the very precondition of being in the world of appearances, of being in the cave, is that you can think the cave, then Kant says, can there be such a thing as pure reason? Because pure reason seems like a paradox. If reason is precisely bound to the world of appearances, then vice versa, purity, the ideal, would have to be a sublimation of reason onto a higher plane. And so when Kant writes The Critique of Pure Reason, he's doing something really radical within the history of philosophy, which is that he's investigating the conditions through which the ideal could be reached. And the conditions through which the ideal can be reached for Kant have to be reason. After all, you are because you think. You think the world. You conceptualize. In fact, there's a deeper paradox here, which is that the very idea of leaving the cave, the very idea of essence or truth, is a concept. And so Kant essentially argues, and I'm simplifying here, that if transcendence is supposed to be that which goes beyond mortal life, but if transcendence has to be conceptualized, then can it really be pure? Isn't it already vulgarized through the fall into reason? And this is something that Hegel makes fun of Kant for. Hegel, in his very ironic way, says, Kant, the ultimate disruptor of the metaphysical divide, somehow fell in love with the idea of essence. He fell in love with the idea. Hegel puts it even more ironically, acerbically. He says that Hegel says that Kant developed the fondness for things in themselves. Because remember, if you're new to this is like the classic Kantian problem, which is that if an object, like this coffee cup, is an object in the world, and it's supposed to be a copy of divine essence, a reflection of essence, then how do we penetrate the object and find the core, the truth, the essence contained within the object? How do we go beyond the object? And this is where Kant comes up with the idea of things in themselves, or das Ding an sich. And Hegel makes fun of Kant because Hegel says that Kant, who had unlocked something so important he didn't even realize it, was still in love with the idea of the ideal or the divine. Namely, that you could transcend the world of appearance and achieve the world of essence. And Hegel simply makes the much more obvious, if you will, but also necessary radical conclusion that he takes from this, which is that what if essence isn't beyond the world of appearance? What if essence is not trapped within objects? What if essence emerges only in the fall? What if the desublimation into the world of appearance is exactly how essence is made manifest? And now we're back at the Hegelian argument apropos the cross and the crucifixion, that what dies on the cross is not the body of Christ. What dies on the cross is the idea of the transcendental deity. In Kant, what dies is not the body of things, objects in the world. What dies is precisely the idea of objects of the beyond. Das Ding an sich. What Kant doesn't realize is that what he perceives as a barrier, namely reason being the paradoxical barrier to the unlocking of transcendental truth, is itself the door, and that essence emerges only in the fall into appearance itself. This is the classic central lesson of Hegelian speculative idealism, is how you go from transcendental Kantian idealism, which is about ascending into the ideal, towards Hegelian speculative idealism, which is about the fall into the ideal. And now we're back at the notion of love. Because for Žižek and Badiou, love is always about the fall into love, which is a metaphor for an argument that is dear to Žižek, which is that it is about Hegelian speculative idealism apropos Kantian transcendental idealism. And so what's classically Žižek here is that he's using something universal and relatable about the human experience, namely falling in love, and he's relating it to a metaphysical proposition, which is that essence doesn't lie beyond appearance, essence lies only within appearance itself. In the same manner that when you fall in love, you fall into the other and thereby unlock your own truth. Hence for Badiou, to go back to Alain Badiou, we have here a metaphysical proposition. If love is a truth process, namely if love is an event, then this means not only that through something seemingly external you have unlocked the truth about you, it also means that the truth doesn't exist outside. The truth isn't external. The truth emerges precisely when the external unlocks the internal. It's a metaphysical proposition that Badiou is making that is very similar to Žižek. Now, of course, the difference between Žižek and Badiou is that Žižek is a Lacanian, Badiou is not. This means that for Žižek, this inner split, loving the lack in the other, as Lacan calls it, is constitutive. It comes from within. For Badiou, this inner split is external. It comes from without. But we can do that in another class. Okay, so I want to end on this idea that Socrates has. Socrates basically says that the practice of philosophy, which is to love wisdom, right? That's the classic idea. Philosophy, love of wisdom. That to really be concerned with the love of wisdom is to try to be as dead as possible in your own life. And you think, wow, that's kind of like a radical proposition. Why would a philosopher try to be as dead as possible in your own life? After all, isn't the process of being alive precisely the process of wanting to explore life and feel good? So why would Socrates say that the goal of the philosopher is to be as dead as possible in their lifetime? Here we have the classic problem that is already depicted within Plato's description of Socrates. Remember, Socrates would have this thing where he would suddenly be transfixed, like rigor mortis. He's like walking around. He could be in the doorway, and suddenly he would stop still or dead in his tracks, and he would be thinking. And sometimes it would go on for hours. At least that was the legend, that Socrates would have like these moments in which suddenly he was so seized by an idea that he stopped functioning. He just froze. It's a little bit like in The Lord of the Rings, the first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, where Gandalf is so deep in thought that he doesn't notice Bilbo entering the door, or Frodo, I don't remember who it is, one of the hobbits. And so there's this idea within philosophy that when you're thinking, when you're concerned on the level of the idea of concept, that you're so into it that suddenly you are dead to the world, that you're just standing there. It's like, this is the classic binary within Platonic metaphysics, which isn't just essence and appearance, but it's also mind versus world. namely that mind or reason accesses the universal. And so when you're thinking, you are no longer fully present. This is something that Lacan already does. Lacan has this joke where he basically takes the Cartesian cogito, the self-transparent subject, Descartes' I think, therefore I am, and he says, actually, it's I think where I am not, and I am not where I think. This is actually true and close to Socrates, the idea being that when you're thinking, you're already not there. You are somewhere else. This is the classic idea of a daydream, right? When you're daydreaming, you're not fully present. Anybody who's sat through a boring class will know what that's like. It's like you're there physically until the bell rings, but your mind is somewhere else. And this process by which your mind is somewhere else is precisely how Socrates, or Plato through Socrates, conceptualizes philosophy. Namely, this weird paradoxical process of being physically there and mentally not there. Now, this problem, which is a sense that you've relegated your body to just being, and your mind is unlocked or is thinking, is at the heart of philosophy itself. And so when Socrates says that within your life you should try to be as dead as possible, what he means is that to contemplate, to exist, to think is precisely about conceptualizing. When you're reading a book, when you're writing, when you're on your phone, you've benched yourself. You're not in life. You are outside of life, and yet you are accessing ideas. It's this weird thing, right? Which is that if you want to really engage with ideas, either through conversation or reading, you have to stop. You have to put your body on hold. You can't go to the bathroom or get up or do something. Now, what's important here is that this is a limited, restricted view. It's not a normative view. Socrates is not saying, here's how you should live, obviously. If everybody just stopped doing what they were doing and just dedicated their life to contemplation, it would be an incredibly bad thing for the world. However, the reason I'm bringing this up is that it links to the idea of the so-called death drive, which is the key Lacanian psychoanalytic concept which he takes from Freud, as he does with every concept. And the idea of the death drive is very similar to Socrates' idea about the love of wisdom. Namely, the death drive isn't that you are moving towards death. The death drive isn't that you want to self-harm. The death drive isn't that we have a morbid fascination or fixation. The death drive isn't that fundamentally life is about antagonism and conflict and we want to destroy each other. That's not the death drive. Instead, the death drive is the peculiar paradox, or if you will, the dialectic, by which you feel most alive at the exact moment that you are doing something that appears to defy your life. For example, when you hike up a mountain, it's like, why do you feel so connected to the world? It's like you've made yourself really small, but you also feel really big inside. Or the French expression for orgasm, which is a petit mort, or a little death. And the exact moment that you are climaxing is the moment in which you've lost control of your body. You don't feel like a person, and yet you somehow feel more alive than ever before. This dialectical process, which is the process of finding yourself within what appears to be an absolute negation, namely desublimation, is at the heart of the death drive. And even more, one of the key concepts that Freud and Lacan relate to the death drive is the idea of repetition compulsion, or Wiederholungszwang. Repetition compulsion is a continuation of the paradox of the death drive, which is that the more you repeat something, the more you do something over and over again, the more alive you feel. It's like you could play tennis and you're just hitting the ball against the wall all day. And it's like you feel really good. You could be running and you achieve so-called runner's high, even though you're just going through a repetitive motion by which you have benched yourself. This is the Socratic idea that philosophy is to be as dead as possible in your lifetime. When you're playing a video game, when you're playing tennis, or when you're going for a run, or when you're climbing a mountain, or when you're having sex, this is what it means to be as dead as possible within your lifetime. It's a beautiful paradox about how we access essence precisely within the process of negation and desublimation on behalf of our own subjectivity. That we become subject to something, and thereby we feel that we are subject. This is the paradox within the word subject. Lacan is totally aware of this, that to be a subject, to be a person, is precisely to be subject to. This is when you climb a mountain, you become subject to the elemental forces of the weather and nature. When you have sex, you become subject to somebody else's passions and fantasies and desires. The process of desubjectivization is precisely the manner in which the subject unfolds. And so we're back at the metaphysical argument that essence isn't the opposite of appearance, that essence emerges within the fall into appearance itself. And now you realize that Socrates is making a similar argument. He just doesn't realize it yet, which is that if to be alive is to be as dead as possible within your life, then vice versa, there is no other way to access life except through its perceived opposite. And we're back at the Lacanian idea that you can't access reality except through fantasy, in the same exact manner that you can't access life except through a kind of living death. And this constant dialectical, two sides of the same coin, unraveling motion is precisely essence. And this is what it means to be alive. Hence why when Žižek makes the argument that you can't have love without the fall, he's not just saying that we're commodifying human experience. He's not just saying that we're an increasingly individualized society in which we fear the fall, in which we don't want to risk everything on behalf of love. Instead, he's also, of course, making a metaphysical argument and a Lacanian argument about the idea that the truth doesn't lie beyond the veil. The truth lies within the veil itself. That essence emerges in the fall into appearance itself. That's the metaphysical claim, which is the same for love. Namely, that love is the fall into love. Love is the retroactive effect of the so-called contingency of necessity, by which you realize that the necessity of the person being your one, the stranger who has become your most intimate connection, is precisely not opposites, it's dialectical. And dialectical is simply this process by which the true nature of something emerges precisely through its seeming negation. That in the Hegelian idea of the unity of opposites, two things that appear to be the opposite tend to end up emerging and unlocking each other's inner truth. This is why Badiou calls love a truth process. A truth process is thereby dialectical. The fall into love is precisely what unlocks the subject. And it's a metaphor for the entire metaphysical project that Žižek continues, which is the metaphysical project of Hegel apropos Kant, apropos Plato. And finally, it's also why Lacan is, for Žižek, always a philosopher first and a psychoanalyst second, because the Lacanian argument, which is that you can't access reality except through fantasy, is the exact same argument that Lacan makes apropos the Parisian veil, which I've talked about in other tutorials, namely that the truth doesn't lie beyond the veil, the truth lies within the veil itself. In the same manner that the rise into love lies not beyond the fall, but it lies within the fall itself. And so the dialectical proposition, which is key to the Hegelian dialectic and Žižek's metaphysics, is precisely to unlock this idea of the fall being the rise. That essence emerges only through the fall into appearance itself. That's the more difficult technical metaphysical argument. All right, thank you guys so much. It's been a lot, but it's been my pleasure. It's super fun for me to do. Thank you to all of the people joining us, both on YouTube and Instagram. It's such a blessing. I feel so incredibly grateful to have you here. We started with something very relatable about falling in love, and we ended somewhere very technical and metaphysical, and that's exactly my goal, that in each and every one of these tutorials, that we take something which you can hopefully relate to, and then we try to use it as a way to open a door into what would otherwise be a much more abstract and conceptual, technical, philosophical argument. I'm so grateful that you were here with me to start off our week in such a thrilling fashion. It's super fun for me. If you'd like to support these classes, because they're all open access and free, and if you'd like to download them, please do take a moment to check out the Patreon. I'm just going to put in a link here. If you enjoyed this, I would love it. I would really, really, really appreciate it if you guys checked out the Patreon. It's www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. And any amount helps. Like, honestly, next one is next Monday. These tutorials are every Monday from 8 to 9 a.m. USA PT. And if you go to www.patreon.com/JenelineJulian, you can become a member. You can join our inner circle. We host an exclusive members-only podcast. We have edited transcripts, my ebook, Introduction to Žižek and Lacan, all the audio for every tutorial I've ever done, which is like more than 100 hours of classes. It's all available on Patreon. So please do take a look at it. That's www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. And I've typed it here, and I'll put it in my stories, and on YouTube, I'll put it in the description. Thank you guys so much. This is such a blessing. I think it's so cool that I get to do this. I feel so incredibly grateful to have your support and to have this learning community. So from me to all of you around the world, I love you all, and thank you for joining us today. I will see you next week. All right. Bye, guys. And thank you to everybody joining on YouTube. You've probably noticed that I've been uploading daily introduction to Žižek and philosophy videos. I'm learning so much. Like, this is an entirely new skill for me, trying to teach myself how to create and edit YouTube videos, which is not something I'd ever done before. Thank you so much for your feedback, for your comments, for pushing me to do better every single day. And I'm curious, like, where this is gonna lead. Like, I feel like every single day I'm learning something, and I hope that you're learning something as well. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye, guys.